The life of medieval prisoners. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you lived in the Middle Ages and were wrongly accused of a crime, whether real or not? Not all of us have thought about it, but if you have ever walked past an ancient castle and seen the narrow iron doors or a dark underground cellar, you can imagine it somewhat. But the truth is often much more complicated and colder. Imagine you are a 13th century peasant living in a small village. One morning, due to some misunderstanding, perhaps a land dispute, or simply a false accusation by a neighbor, you are arrested by the guards. There is no lawyer, no modern court. You are simply taken to a place called the temporary prison, where you await the Lord's decision on your fate. Medieval dungeons were nothing like today's prisons. They had no bed frames, no mattresses, no proper windows. Most prisons were dark, dank stone vaults, sometimes directly underground. You would be locked up with many other people, young or old, male or female, serious or minor. The only things all prisoners had in common were hunger, cold, and the feeling of being forgotten. Older people, like you or me today, would have a hard time surviving in those conditions. Imagine the biting cold in winter, the constant dripping of water from the wet stone vault above, and the stench of bodies, garbage, and untreated sewage. There were no toilets. Prisoners defecated in the corner of the cell, and those who were stronger tried to push the waste out the iron door with a log or their bare feet. Meals. If you were lucky, you were given a loaf of hard bread and a little water each day. Occasionally, thin porridge, ladled from an iron pot shared by the whole prison. If you were poor and had no family to visit you with food, a rare occurrence, since travel was difficult, hunger was your most loyal companion. At this point, you might be thinking, why were they so cruel? Isn't it possible for anyone to be wrongly arrested? True, but back then, prison wasn't meant to reform or educate like it is today. It was a tool of control, a means of physical and mental punishment. Some people were imprisoned simply for owing money, or for refusing to pay taxes, things that today we can resolve through civil courts or civil defense laws. In prison, you quickly learn that as long as you're alive, there's hope. Some prisoners will try to befriend the guards, hoping to trade a few scraps of food for items or information. Others, especially older prisoners, will stay quiet, hiding in the darkest corners, hoping to go unnoticed. Sadly, silence doesn't always protect you. In the darkness, your fellow prisoners can sometimes pose a threat. Fights over food, over a place to sleep, or simply because someone is losing control. It happens every night. And then there's the other aspect that few people talk about, loneliness. Imagine being separated from your family, not knowing when you'll be released, not knowing who remembers you. There was no mail system in the Middle Ages. If no one came to see you, you wouldn't know if the world was still spinning. A day in prison passed slowly, like a week. And for those in their 40s and 50s, their health began to decline, their eyesight blurred, their joints ached, and the waiting became a gnawing torment. Perhaps the scariest thing of all is that you don't know what to expect. Some people are sentenced to death and are waiting for their execution, but they are not told in advance. The guards may open the door in the middle of the night, tie you up, and lead you away. Others await trial, but justice is not a light, it is a game of chance. You may be released, or you may be beaten, or even killed, all because of one wrong remark during interrogation. For women, things were even worse. They were vulnerable to attack, defamation, and little protection. Many women were arrested on suspicion of witchcraft, a rumor that was enough to land them in prison. And if they were old, toothless, wrinkled, and living alone, they were even more vulnerable. Society feared what it did not understand, and prisoners, especially those who were isolated, paid the price for that fear. So how did they endure? How could a medieval person, perhaps like you, already halfway through his life, survive in such seemingly inhuman circumstances? Because surviving in a medieval prison was not just a matter of physical strength, but also of mental strength. Even when pushed to the brink of suffering, many prisoners still found a reason to live. It could be the desire to see their loved ones again, a glimmer of hope for acquittal, or simply the belief that tomorrow could be different from today. Some inmates try to stay sane by replaying stories in their heads, as a way of telling themselves stories. Some whisper prayers. Others think of happy memories of freedom, the sound of roosters crowing in the morning, family meals, feeling of the sun on their faces after harvest. These seemingly trivial things, in prison, become precious landmarks to cling to. Of course, not everyone is so strong. Those who are weaker, or who cannot find a way out of their thoughts, often fade away gradually. They do not cry, do not struggle, simply lie in a corner, do not talk, do not eat, until their bodies give up. It is not a sudden death, it is a quiet withdrawal from life, like a candle burning out. Prisoners in those days also had no access to medical care. If someone was injured, had a fever, or was sick, they were left to fend for themselves. Disease spread easily in enclosed, damp, unsanitary spaces. Small scratches could become infected, swollen, and gangrenous. A single cough from a person could be the start of an epidemic, plunging the entire prison into panic. But somehow, life managed to creep in, cling on. Sometimes, a little food smuggled in by a sympathetic soldier, or a dry cloth to wrap around a cracked foot, was enough to pull someone through the despair. And strangely enough, in such circumstances, strange relationships begin to form. Perhaps a young person shares a slightly drier bed with an old man who is shivering. Perhaps a once aggressive person begins to protect those weaker than himself, not because of rules or rewards, but simply because of the feeling that, if we can help each other a little, life will be less cruel. There are also stories of strange friendships that have developed behind bars. An old woman once recounted that she had been arrested for not paying taxes, and in prison she met a girl who had been convicted of stealing bread. They had nothing to do with each other than being in prison together. But, according to the woman, they became like mother and daughter. She told her life story. The girl gave up her food. When one of them was released, the other cried, not because of regret, but because she had lost the only spiritual support she had left in the darkness. You see, when people are middle-aged or older, they often think they are past their best. But in medieval prisons, older people were often remarkably resilient. They didn't need to scream or get angry to show their bravery. They endured, listened, and transmitted their calmness to the younger ones. Perhaps it was because they had experienced loss and had learned that life isn't always fair. But that didn't mean giving up. In the harshness of prison life, patience becomes a precious thing. Waiting each day, each moment, to hear a familiar footstep, the sound of a loved one carrying a cloth bag containing a few potatoes, or just to see each other for a few short seconds through the bars. Those are gifts that surpass all material values. Some prisoners, in their despair, begged for an early trial, knowing that the trial would end in a death sentence. They chose death over oblivion, but there were also those who were so persistent that, even after spending a year or even many years in prison, they did not give up hope. When they were released, they walked out with white hair, trembling legs, and a gaze full of depth, because they knew that only those who have gone through darkness can truly appreciate the light. And while none of us would like to imagine ourselves in such a situation, their stories remind us that human strength lies in more than physical strength. It lies in perseverance, in connection, and in the ability to find meaning, even in places where all hope seems lost. And at this point, you might be wondering, why were so many people imprisoned under such conditions? Were they all bad guys, thieves, or murderers? In fact, medieval life was not that simple. Some people were arrested simply because they were poor, being late with their taxes, taking on debts that they couldn't repay, or simply passing through the territory at the wrong time. That was enough to get them thrown in jail. And the law was nothing like it is today. There were no lawyers to defend them, no fair system of supervision. Power was in the hands of a few, and luck was sometimes the only thing on your side. There were prisoners who were imprisoned for heresy. That is, their religious beliefs were different from those of the majority. An old woman living alone on the edge of a village, who knew how to mix herbal medicines, could be accused of being a witch and arrested. Someone could be convicted of treason for saying a single false statement about the king. A rumor, a strange look, or even the jealousy of a neighbor. That was enough to send a person to the bottom of life. And then, once in prison, they are often forgotten. No one asks. No petitions. No one intervenes. Time passes, and people gradually become shadows. But the amazing thing is, it is in such a situation that the true nature of each person is most clearly revealed. Some people, despite their misery, continue to share. Some become storytellers in prison. Every night, they sit quietly and recount old legends and stories to keep the spirits of the remaining people up. Those are small fires, enough to light up a dark night. Meanwhile, some prisons, especially in large cities or near monasteries, have a chaplain's presence. Although not many, sometimes priests are allowed into the prison to bless, hear confessions, or simply bring a few wafers and a smile. And you might not expect it. Just a sincere greeting can bring tears to someone's eyes, because in the darkness, the presence of a non-judgmental person is an immeasurable gift. In some places, punishments were more humiliating than simple imprisonment. For example, the neck shackle, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, was placed in the middle of the market. The punished person was locked there for hours while the villagers stared at him, cursed him, and threw scraps at him. Sometimes this public punishment was harsher than prison because it took away the only thing a person had left, his dignity. But some people, despite being humiliated like that, stood tall, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They refused to let anyone take away their self-respect. And that, in the harshness of the times, was an extremely powerful act. But don't think all prisons are the same. There are damp underground dungeons where rats and insects crawl over your skin as you sleep. But there are also rich cells where prisoners are allowed to bring their own bedding and are given decent food if they can afford it. Inequality has been around for a long time, you see. Even in prison, the rich live better than the poor. Among the prisoners, there are women and children, babies born in prison because their mothers were imprisoned before, or sometimes the children of bankrupt families with no place to go. There are babies who have never seen the sunlight outside the stone walls. There are girls imprisoned only because they dare to say no to those in power. And the most precious thing about these people is that they have not lost their kindness. An old woman, who had been imprisoned for years, when she was released still chose to stay near the prison. Every day she cooked a small pot of porridge to bring to the prisoners. "Because I know that feeling," she said. "Just a warm meal is enough to keep people from giving up." You may think these stories are far-fetched, but the truth is, whenever we feel suffering, lonely, or misunderstood, the experiences of those medieval prisoners are closer than ever. While times have changed, human emotions have remained the same. The desire to be seen, to be heard, to be kind, that is eternal. Maybe you're sitting in a quiet room, watching the soft light of a candle shine through a warm cup of tea. Imagine, just for a moment, that you're in a cold place where everything seems to be taken away. And if in that moment, someone reaches out to you, that gesture, however small, will be something you'll never forget. As we delve deeper into the days of imprisonment, we begin to feel more clearly the way time slowly torments people. For a medieval prisoner, time is no longer measured in days or weeks, but in shadows cast across stone walls, in the footsteps of guards, in the slight rattle of chains whenever someone moves in the dark. When hope of early release was gone, people began to seek out more human ways to survive. Some began to carve their names on the walls, along with brief prayers, not for others to read, but as a statement, "I was here." Those words, many now faded by the centuries, were the silent voices of forgotten fates, a final proof that, even in the darkness, they still retained some dignity, some meaning. Some turned to religion, small pieces of wood carved into the shape of a cross, or simply a stone placed in a corner where the first light of dawn hits each morning. The gesture, however small, gives them a rhythm to life, a routine to cling to. It's like making a cup of tea every morning, isn't it? When there's nothing left to control, people cling tightly to whatever little remains. Some prisoners, especially those in prisons close to residential areas, found ways to communicate with the outside world. They whispered messages through cracks in the walls, or hid letters under stones for family members, or even kind passers-by to find. There is a recorded story of a wife who walked through the back wall of her prison every night, singing an old lullaby. It was the only way to let her husband know that she had not been forgotten. And in that very dungeon, friendship, a luxury that seems to be rare, flourished. When there was nothing left to lose, trust became the last bond. There were couples who cared for each other when illness struck. Some shared their food rations, even if it was just a few pieces of rock-hard bread. A small gesture, but in that situation, it was almost miraculous. Sometimes, even the guards are moved by human resilience. Some guards have secretly left a piece of cheese or a piece of apple in the corner of the cell, not because of some great awakening of conscience, but because, after months of witnessing the patience and quiet kindness of the prisoners, they began to feel unable to ignore it. The Middle Ages saw earlier attempts at prison reform than many people realize. Some towns began allowing prisoners to work, weaving, carpentry, in exchange for food and supplies. While utilitarian, it also gave the prisoners a sense of worth. They were making something, using their hands to create something, rather than just waiting around aimlessly. As for dreams, you may be surprised to learn that it is in the darkest places that the most vivid dreams are born. A boy imprisoned with his mother for begging once told of his dreams of riding a horse through the fields, his hair flying in the wind. A blind man, a former itinerant musician, hums a few old tunes every night, not to entertain anyone, but to remind himself of what he once was. In the darkness, imagination is the only light that no one can take away. Perhaps you have experienced the feeling of being trapped by life's difficulties, an illness, a loss, or simply a loneliness that no one sees. And if so, you can understand what the medieval prisoners felt, that sometimes the only thing that keeps us going is not our physical strength, but a small belief that all suffering will pass. That as long as we have someone to remember, someone to love, no matter what the circumstances, we are not truly defeated. And here, if you ask yourself, what happens after a prisoner is released? The answer is not simple. For some, freedom is not comforting, because they return to a world that no longer recognizes them. Losing their home, losing their identity, they have to start over with nothing. But strangely, many become guardians. They go around telling what they saw, what they learned in the dark, so that others do not have to suffer the same. They became voices, and in an age without cameras and newspapers, these stories were a light shining on the dark corners that society would rather forget. A few became writers, monks, itinerant storytellers. They turned their pain into lessons, and in doing so, found themselves again. When talking about medieval prisoners, people often imagine suffering, coldness, and cruelty. But what few people think about is that these people, after stepping out of the stone walls and darkness, brought with them a completely different perspective on life. Perhaps, after surviving the harshest conditions, people will no longer look at life with the same eyes. They are no longer afraid of the dark because they have lived in it. They are no longer worried about hunger because they are used to it. And most of all, they understand people. Some people, though not many, have become voices for the forgotten. They go around telling stories of prison, of things society has deliberately forgotten. There's a priest who used to be a prisoner and stands in the village market, telling his story every week, not to lament, but to help people understand the value of mercy. His story, about a fellow prisoner who once gave him half a piece of bread, has brought silence to the crowd, and some people have started giving food to the beggars nearby. There are also those who choose to live quietly. An old woman who was imprisoned for not paying her taxes, after being released, opened a small kitchen for the poorest people in the area. No one knew about her past, but she always quietly shared extra food, always saving a corner of the table for someone who happened to pass by. They didn't need to thank her, she said. As long as they lived a little better, that was enough. What is remarkable is that it is those who have been pushed out of society who are most able to see through society. They do not just see someone hungry, they see someone abandoned. They do not just see a child begging, they remember themselves, years ago, tied to a corner for stealing a potato. And it is that memory that makes them unable to turn away. Prison life can be physically crushing, but it is also where many people discover an extraordinary strength of spirit. Not everyone has the strength to step out and do great things, but as long as they do not let bitterness eat away at their hearts, they have won. Looking back today, it's easy to forget that advances in law, in human rights, in the way we treat wrongdoers, all of them were once paid for by the pain of those who did. Every stone in the ancient prisons was once soaked with the sweat, tears, and sometimes blood of those who were forgotten. But they, in some way, left an unspoken message that human dignity cannot be chained, that kindness can flourish in the harshest of places. Perhaps that is what makes us, in this modern age, still stop for a moment to listen, not because we like suffering, but because in that suffering, a part of human nature appears most clearly, the ability to sympathize, to be resilient, and to change. If you, middle-aged or older, have ever felt left out, or lived through days when no one seemed to understand you, these stories will resonate with you. They are a reminder that everyone, no matter where they are, can be a light for others, if we choose not to extinguish the fire in our hearts. Thank you for coming with me on this journey, a journey that is not just about prison and sin, but about the human heart, about how we look at each other, and about the hope, however fragile, that is always present in the most unexpected places. If this story touched a part of your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me about what keeps you hopeful, even after all these years. And if you want to hear more stories like this, about people, about history, and about life, don't forget to like and subscribe. I wish you a peaceful evening. And if you are listening to this before going to bed, I wish you sweet dreams, ones in which the light finds its way through the darkness.